Hello, this is Colin Liddell, and this is the Shortpod, a brief and succinct podcast commenting on the events and issues of the day. And today it is the 7th of January 2026. Now, the most important issue of the day today, I think, is the sanity or otherwise of the American president, Donald Trump. Recently, Trump commanded his special forces to kidnap a president of another country in blatant violation not only of international law, but also the American Constitution. A lot of people were very impressed by the professionalism of the American Special Services, but they also seem to have had a little bit of inside help from elements in the Venezuelan government. So we're not really entirely sure of the exact chain of events. But whether the US Special Forces did a good job or not is entirely irrelevant. This is exactly the same kind of operation that any president in living memory could have commanded the American Special Forces to carry out. It is no proof of Trump's competence. The decision to command the Special Forces to carry out this madcap operation, however, is proof of Trump's mental competence. And what we see here is a plan that goes nowhere, an operation that could have ended in disaster, the breaking of US and international law, and an increase in the amount of chaos in the world. And this is all proof, really, of Trump's insanity, his senility, the fact that he's going off the rails. Now, I think Trump has always been a narcissist. He's always been a megalomaniac, an egomaniac. He's always been quite stupid in many, many ways. But it's very easy to blame the president. How about blaming the voters? The voters put him in there. They fell for his shtick. They fell for his bullshit. They saw something of themselves in Donald Trump, which is why they voted for him. Now, there is an element of truth in that. The voters are partially responsible for an aberration like Donald Trump. But also, I think this is a structural problem of American politics, and that's really the thing I want to talk about today. With Donald Trump, I think the Americans just got unlucky, but that was because on previous occasions they had been lucky. Now, what I'm talking about is mental incapacity. Now, in the case of Donald Trump, the mental incapacity is toxic and dangerous. The previous president, Joe Biden, that was also an extreme case of mental incapacity. Mental incapacity is not an uncommon phenomenon among US presidents. Usually the mental incapacity is not of the toxic, dangerous variety that we see in Donald Trump. It's more of the kind of sleepy, I don't really know what I'm doing, please tell me which buttons to push and which policies to sign because I'm a bit senile and sleepy and I want to have my cocoa variety of mental incapacity. Now, there are many examples of this. I would say the first good example would be the 1980s with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a bit of a dimwit. He was a bit too old for the job. But, he had sensible people around him. And luckily for America, for the most part, he was happy to listen to them. Also, Bush Jr., George W. Bush, he was a bit of a dummy, but really not as dumb as he pretended to be. And then, of course, the best example was Joe Biden. Now, why does the American system constantly put people who are mentally challenged in this most mentally challenging of positions? And I think really it's because in America you have a very large country. You have 50 states. They're all quite separate. Each state doesn't really know what's going on in all the other states. And then in addition to that, you also have a voter base which is notoriously low info. The number of politically engaged people in America is remarkably low. And for the most part, most Americans are very, very low info on politics. They don't really know what's going on. They don't really know who's who. They don't know about parties. They don't know about policies. And as a consequence, they're frequently taken advantage of. Now, in order to win a US presidential election, what you need is name recognition. And it's very difficult to get coast-to-coast name recognition across such a a large number of low information voters. And so this is why the American system produces presidents like Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, he was a film star, he was a familiar figure, and he got into politics. He served his apprenticeship as governor of California. And so by the time he started to push his name forward as a presidential candidate, most Americans kind of sort of knew who he was. And that was his main strength in the Republican primaries and then in the presidential contests that followed. He was replaced by his vice president, who obviously, kind of coasted to the presidency on his coattails. People had got a chance to know who Bush Sr. was because he was vice president for 8 years, but they didn't really like him, and so he was chucked out. And then in the 1992 election, you had a genuine fresh face in Bill Clinton. He was a relatively young guy, and he was somebody who was at the kind of peak of his mental powers while he was president. He was quite an effective president. Because he was young, he had certain other problems, like his libido, etc. But, he was a genuine fresh face when he became president. Then he was replaced by, guess what, another Bush, George W. Bush. He wasn't particularly famous, but at least he was connected to a famous family, the Bush family. That helped him to get over the line. The case of Barack Obama, the next president, he was a genuinely fresh face, but he had the added shock value of being black to help him get known by every strata of American society. So being black, the shock value, the sub-racist horror or alternatively enthusiasm that this created enabled him to kind of short-circuit the system and become famous everywhere with low information people very, very quickly. And that enabled him to become president. And then following on from Obama, the next president was, of course, Donald Trump. Trump had spent his whole life being famous, usually for bad reasons. He'd been on Home Alone 2, he'd been on a lot of TV shows, he had his reality TV show, The Apprentice. He'd been this garish, larger-than-life celebrity figure, always at the front of some stupid project. So Americans, despite their default setting of extremely low information, knew who he was. This enabled him to quickly outstrip his competitors in the Republican Party, possibly with quite a lot of outside help. And so he became president a bit late in life, becoming a little bit gaga, but not too much, and still surrounded by enough sensible people to keep him in check. But even in his first presidency, there were already signs of insanity creeping in. And this led to the 2020 election, a rather strange election in many ways, but one in which the Democrat Party, instead of choosing a healthy young candidate at the peak of his mental powers who could take the fight to Donald Trump, decided to stick with the name recognition of Joe Biden. Joe Biden, by that stage, he had been in politics for decades. Of course, he had served for 8 years as Barack Obama's vice president. So everybody in America kind of sort of knew who he was. And so the Dems thought that was the safest ticket to defeat Donald Trump. And so that was the decision they made. And, probably they made the right decision because America is such a large country and there are so many low information voters that if they had chosen anybody else, there would have been a lot of head scratching, and a lot of them would probably have voted for Donald Trump because they didn't know who the other guy was. That's how stupid American politics is. So they went for Biden, probably the correct choice in a sense, but the big mistake was that they stuck with Biden too long, and his flagrant imbecility and senility became all too apparent too late in the election cycle. So they were forced to throw in Kamala Harris. And of course, people who are interested in politics kind of knew who she was. But the vast majority of American voters, this great bulk of low information people, had no idea who she was. And she had to go up against the undisputed name recognition of Donald Trump. And that is really the reason that she lost. And so we got Donald Trump on the cusp of 80, a very deeply embittered man, a man who is becoming increasingly angry, outraged, unhinged, and insane who became president. Now, that was partly due to the voters, partly due to a lot of stupid old boomers seeing something of themselves in him. But it was also very much part of the structure of America as a political entity, of a country that is simply too large and has too many low information people involved in the political process. So if America wants to stop electing a complete lunatic again, these are very deep and profound structural problems that they will have to face. Over and out.